Hey guys, so for today's lecture, we are going to be looking at the United States Constitution. Sorry, y'all, it's been a long day already. We're going to be looking at the United States Constitution, and we're going to be looking at the powers that are provided to the states, which includes Texas, but also what the federal powers are. So at this point, you're probably asking, why are we learning about this? This isn't federal government, which is true. But you see Texas kind of butting heads with the federal government a lot in the news. And really, that's what this chapter is about. When Texas is butting heads with the federal government, is Texas right or is the federal government right? Who has the power in these situations? So we're just going to start off generally talking about what does our government look like and what do some other governments look like? So let's start with the first option of government, which would be a unitary system of government. In a unitary system of government, one central government has ultimate authority. So think any sort of authoritarian regime. Think North Korea, think China. In any one of those systems, the central government has the ultimate authority. That does not mean that there can't be smaller regional governments. Those regional or local governments are going to be subordinate to the central government. What that means is those regional governments, they get their power from the central government. They have no power except for that which is given to them by the federal government. So unitary system, think authoritarian form of government. Now, here's the opposite, confederal system. And you guys probably remember this, hopefully, from your history classes. So confederal system is a system of government in which member states or regional governments have all the authority. And any central government has only the power that the state governments chose to delegate to it. So this is basically the opposite of that unitary form of government. This is basically where the regional powers have all of the authority. Again, they can create a central power, but that central power is going to depend on those lower levels of government to get all of its power. So the local or regional governments are really the ones with all of the power. Any power that the central government has is derived from what those local governments give it. So good modern day example of this is going to be the European Union. Most of the time, you don't see confederal systems of government work out very well because usually there needs to kind of be somebody that's in charge. And you can see some of this fracturing and division within the EU today. Really good example of that is Brexit, if you're following the news at all. Okay, federal systems. Federal systems are ones in which government power is divided and shared between a national or central government and state or regional government. So that's what you're going to see in most modern countries. That's the system of government that we have. These federal states can be democratic or they can be non-democratic. More often they're democratic. So if we look at Germany, if we look at Canada, if we look at the United States, these are all federal systems of government. Neither the state government nor the federal government are dependent on the other one for their power. Instead, how do we figure out where we're getting power from? We figure it out by looking at the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution is going to tell us what powers does the federal government have and what powers does the state have. So let's start first just by talking about what powers does the federal government have. So when we've got Texas butting heads with the federal government, what does the United States Constitution say that the federal government gets to do? The federal government has something called delegated powers. So delegated powers are powers that the Constitution gives to the national government. It's going to include enumerated powers as well as some other powers that we're going to talk about as well. Okay, so think about this as, let's do this. We're going to go to the whiteboard. Give me 1 second to navigate away from the slides. Okay. So we would write up here, for those of you who are more visual learners, delegated, okay? And then under the umbrella of delegated powers, we're going to have those other powers that we're talking about. So over here, we're going to get expressed. We're going to have implied. And we're going to have inherent. Your textbook is going to talk a little bit less about inherent than the other ones, just because this is not a federal government class, and so most of what we're going to deal with is the expressed and implied powers, but inherent will be there as well. So when we're talking about delegated powers, we're talking about what powers does the federal government have that are laid out in the United States Constitution. So within those delegated powers, we have express, we have implied, and we have inherent. Okay, let's go back over to our PowerPoint. Okay, so expressed powers are going to be powers that are clearly listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8 is going to go in and lay out powers that Congress has. So what does Congress get to do? Congress gets to go in and create a postal service. Congress gets to go in and provide for trademark laws and copyright laws, patent laws. Congress gets to go in and raise a militia. So Article 1, Section 8 is going to very explicitly lay out what does the federal government get to do. Implied powers are going to be powers that are derived from those expressed powers. So they're going to be delegated powers that are assumed to exist in order for the federal government to perform the functions that are expressly delegated. These powers are granted by something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is at the end of Article 1, Section 8. It's basically like a, oops, maybe we forgot something clause. The Necessary and Proper Clause says the federal government can also do anything else that's not listed in Article 1, Section 8 if it needs to be able to do that thing in order to carry out one of the jobs listed in Article 1, Section 8. So because the federal government gets to establish a system of postal networks, the federal government also gets to employ postal workers. It doesn't say that explicitly in the United States Constitution, but we know that that's implied, right? Because how else are we going to have a postal service? So implied powers are powers that are derived from those expressed powers listed in Article 1, Section 8. So when we're trying to figure out, can Congress do this thing that Congress wants to do, we always look first at the expressed powers. And let's navigate away to the whiteboard for those of you who are a little bit more visual. Okay. So express powers plus the necessary and proper clause, which you're also going to hear referred to as the elastic clause, are going to equal implied powers. So anytime we're trying to figure out, does the federal government have this implied power, we first need to look at Article 1, Section 8, those expressed powers. Only if we see some basis there in Article 1, Section 8, can we then move on to say, okay, does the federal government need to be able to do this other thing in order to carry out one of the expressed powers? All right, so let's switch back to the PowerPoint. All right. So then we've got inherent powers. Those are going to be delegated powers that come with an office or position, generally the executive branch, which is why this chapter of your textbook is not really going to talk so much about the inherent powers. That really usually is more geared towards presidential powers. Although the U.S. Constitution does not clearly specify powers granted to the executive branch, over time, inherent powers have evolved as part of the powers needed to perform the functions of the executive branch. Okay, so those are the powers that the federal government gets. Those are the delegated powers, expressed, implied, and inherent. And remember that for the most part in this course, we're talking about the expressed and implied powers. Now let's talk about what powers does the state get. So the state has reserved powers. Reserved powers are provided to the states through the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment states that states have any power not delegated by the Constitution. So any power not given to the federal government is reserved to the states. Now, think about that originally. When our framers very first set that up, they had this short list, relatively short list, of things that the federal government got to do. They get to go in and they get to create the Postal Service, and they get to go in and create those patents and immigration system and all that other stuff, right? But really the list is not super long. The 10th Amendment says anything we didn't give to the federal government, we're reserving to the states. So if you think back on our history, we were really concerned about what was happening with big federal government, right? Because we had just broken away from England. And so we wanted to give a whole lot of power to the states. So federal government, you get this very defined list of things to do, and state, you get all of the rest of it. So that was kind of the original framework that we were operating under. Now, understand that over time, this evolved. So it evolved so that the states got less power and the federal government got more power. And one way in which this happened was through concurrent powers. So concurrent powers are powers that are provided to both the state and the national government. So think about taxes, for example. When you go to the store and you buy something, you pay a sales tax. And a fairly large portion of that sales tax goes over to the state, and with the remainder going to local government. But it's basically a state tax, right? Well, the state can tax you because it needs to be able to do stuff within the state. It needs that revenue in order to work on roads and libraries and the state capitol and whatever else. The federal government is able to tax you through income taxes because it also needs money. It needs to be able to pay our troops. It needs to be able to pay our congressmen. It needs to be able to pay for all of those different things. So both the states and the national government have the ability to tax. That's going to be an example of where we see concurrent powers. Okay, let's do this. Let's go real quick to this slide, just so that you can see an illustration of what I'm talking about. Now, I usually tell my classes, you could go through and memorize the different powers, but that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for you. Because if you think about this for a minute, these are just going to inherently make a fair amount of sense. So let's start first with those delegated powers. And remember, delegated powers are just what national powers does the federal government have? Okay, the federal government can go in, they can declare war, they can raise armies, enter into treaties, coin money. That's all them. That means that it's not concurrent, so the state doesn't have it too, and it's not reserved to the states, so the states don't get to do it on their own. Now let's think about that for a minute. It really wouldn't make very much sense for it to be anything other than a delegated power, the ability to declare war, right? Because if we were to allow that, then Texas could be at war with Iran, and California might not. So just from a logical perspective, we want the delegated powers to be things that we usually think of wanting some kind of cohesion throughout the country. Same thing with entering into treaties or with coining money, right? Think about what a nightmare that would be if every time you traveled across state lines, you had to exchange currency because each state had their own money that they were coining. That would be really cumbersome, and it would be difficult to travel between the states. That doesn't make very much sense. So we want the federal government to be in control of that. This one is going to look really boring, but it's going to end up becoming really important later on. Regulating international and interstate commerce. So the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution provides that Congress has the ability to regulate commerce between the states. So if states are trading or conducting some other type of commerce across state lines, then Congress has the ability to go in and legislate over that. If it's all within one state, so if instead of inter, it's intra-state commerce, the federal government doesn't have any control over that. So interstate commerce goes to the national government. Intrastate commerce is going to go to the states. It's going to be something that's reserved to them. Okay, concurrent powers. Remember, we said concurrent powers are going to be the powers that are shared between the federal government and the state. So levying taxes, we talked about that. Borrowing money, same idea. Both the state and the federal government are going to need to be able to accomplish things. And in order to do that, they're going to need money. Chartering banks, we're going to talk about that some more. State powers you see over here, these are things that, again, if you think about it from a common sense perspective, we want the states to be in charge of. So things like establishing local government. We want the state to be in charge of what types of local governments will be established. What's that structure within that local government community going to look like? We want them to exercise state police powers. We allow them to conduct elections. So things that feel like they should be more run closer to home, those are going to be state powers. And things that feel like we need some sense of national unity on, those are going to be national powers. Okay, so let's talk briefly about how we figure out if there's a clash between the United States, the federal government, and the state of Texas. Okay, so let's pretend it's any one of those number of times that we were talking about where Texas is saying, federal government, I think you're overreaching, and I don't think you get to do this thing. Well, let's imagine that it's a concurrent power. Let's say that the state of Texas gets to do this thing, but the federal government also gets to do this thing. Okay, if there is a conflict between federal law and state law, then federal law must be followed. That's the supremacy clause that's in the United States Constitution. So if there's a conflict between the states and the federal government is going to win. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that necessary and proper clause that we were discussing earlier. So your textbook is going to talk about a case of McCulloch versus Maryland. And McCulloch versus Maryland really had to do with whether or not the federal government could establish a bank. So the federal government set up a bank, and the state of Maryland was not very excited about this because they basically felt like it was competing with their bank. So they decided that they were going to tax the national bank, not for a legitimate purpose, but really because they were just trying to tax the national bank out of existence. So the federal bank says, no, we're not going to pay this tax. And so ultimately it goes up to the United States Supreme Court. And originally the issue was whether or not the federal bank has to pay this tax. It becomes about a larger issue, though, which is, was the federal government able to create that bank to begin with? Because what was happening at the time is we were just looking at the list on Article 1, Section 8 to figure out, does the federal government get to do this thing it wants to do? And we didn't see chartering a bank anywhere on that list. And so we'd all assumed that it was a reserved power. It was something that was reserved to the states. Well, what the court decided was that this was really an implied power. So it's really the first time that you see the court look at the necessary and proper clause and start giving this expansion of federal power. And so they say, okay, even though it's not listed anywhere in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress gets to go in and create this bank, we know that Congress gets to coin money. We know that it gets to tax. We know that it gets to do all of these other things. And so in order to do those things effectively, doesn't it really make sense that they have somewhere to store their currency? So even though we don't see that ability listed in Article 1, Section 8, we think that the federal government still has it because of the necessary and proper clause. Remember, the necessary and proper clause is also called the elastic clause. The reason for that is that it expands the power of the federal government. Remember, anytime we're expanding the power of the federal government, though, to some extent, we're shrinking the power of the state. So bear that in mind as we continue on through the chapter. Usually, in my class also, we talk about a couple of other cases that are good examples of this. Since for the online semester, we're really kind of trying to closely track with the textbook. We won't go into them too fully, but if you're interested, you might look up the case of Wickard versus Filburn, or the Heart of Atlanta Motel Company case. Those all deal with the idea of expansion of federal power. Okay, so what did we think about the state's role versus the federal government's role early on in our history? Well, early on in our history, we had this concept of dual federalism, which I usually tell my class, think of it as like the federal government and the state dueling. Spelled differently, different word, but it kind of helps to paint that mental image for you. So early on, we thought the national government was one of the enumerated powers only. So we were only looking at that list, Article 1, Section 8, to figure out whether or not the federal government got to do this thing it wanted to do. The purposes which the national government may constitutionally promote are few. So we thought the federal and state governments were both sovereign within their sphere of influence. There was very little overlapping or concurrent power as we thought. We saw the relationship between the federal government and the states as one of tension rather than collaboration. That's that dueling principle that we were talking about. We thought of the federal government as being really constrained in terms of what it could do. The state had a lot of power, and the state and the federal government were really at odds with one another. Over time, you see this idea of cooperative federalism, and it replaced this idea of dual federalism. This idea was one where the national government and the states are mutually complementary parts of a single government mechanism. So the idea And cooperative federalism is that the state and the federal government are working together to make our country more effective. This is when you start to see a real expansion in the implied powers. In terms of when we really start to see a rise in cooperative federalism, we tend to see that around the time of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was just this really, really bad time in the economy. People were starving, there were bread lines, people were committing suicide because they were really, really depressed about their economic states. It was just a really bad time for the country in general. And so what we saw was the national government stepping in and taking over control to some extent to try to lift our country out of the economic recession that we were in. And you're also going to see it step up in terms of grants, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. So this idea of cooperative federalism really started to take hold during the Great Depression. Okay. So the Depression also helped foster those New Deal grant and aid programs. What's meant by this is the federal government basically started handing out free money. So if any of y'all are on Pell Grants, think of it like that, right? A grant is the best type of money. It's where somebody else gives you money and you don't have to pay it back. So this is what the federal government was doing during this time. It was saying, here you go, states, here's some money, go invest in your infrastructure, go invest in other public works, and in exchange, you don't have to pay us back. Now, at the time when this was very first instituted, we saw a lot of categorical grants being handed out. And when we say categorical grants, we're talking about grants that are a little bit more restrictive. So they're federal aid to state or local governments for specific purposes that are granted under restrictive conditions and often require matching funds from the receiving government. So with those categorical grants, the federal government is being very explicit in terms of telling the states exactly how they have to spend that money. Over time, we've still seen this grant practice continue, but we've started to see federal aid move towards block grants. So block grants are federal grants to state or local governments for more general purposes and with fewer restrictions than categorical grants. This process, this moving away from categorical grants to block grants, this is called devolution. So it's the attempt to enhance the power of state or local governments, especially by replacing relatively restrictive categorical grants and aid with the more flexible block grants. So over time, instead of the federal government controlling all of these funds really closely and telling the states exactly what they could do with that, we start to see more and more restriction. More and more relaxation. Sorry about that, y'all. So the idea here is that the states are probably going to know how best to spend this money and how best to impose their own restrictions without the federal government stepping in. That process, that loosening of the restrictions, is devolution. Sorry, those are my puppies. Hold, please. Okay. Sorry, they're playing tug of war over a stuffed animal. I don't know if y'all's homes are anywhere near as crazy as mine is currently, but I apologize. Okay, so over time, we see this cooperative federalism. Well, eventually, states like Texas tend to see the federal government and the state working less in cooperation than they feel like really the federal government is coercing Texas into doing what it wants. And you see part of this through the Civil Rights Acts. So the first thing that you see this in is the separate but equal doctrine, Plessy versus Ferguson. If you think back to the original framework that we discussed, education is usually left up to the states, right? That's a reserved power. So when in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court steps in, the federal government, and says, you know what? You do get to continue to keep these classrooms separated. However, the accommodations have to be equal. So the buildings have to be equal, and the textbooks have to be equal, and the teachers have to be equal. Well, that's a form of the federal government stepping in and telling the states what they have to do in an area that's traditionally a reserved power. Same thing when we talk about like Jim Crow laws, for example, or Brown versus Board of Education. So Jim Crow laws, remember, were just those state and local laws that mandated racial segregation in almost every aspect of life. Well, over time, the federal government stepped in and started saying, no, states, you can't pass these types of laws. And in Brown versus Board of Education, remember, that's where the big federal government stepped in and they said, states, you have to integrate your classroom. Another area that we saw the states kind of start to push back on with this whole federal government telling them what to do was with the Voting Rights Act, which you're going to see abbreviated as the VRA. The VRA established this concept of preclearance. So preclearance was any administrative or legislative change to the rules governing elections in covered states. And it had to be submitted for pre-approval to either the U.S. Department of Justice or the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. So again, if we think back to that chart we were looking at a minute ago, reserved powers, powers that the state generally gets, elections are going to fall into the reserved powers category. Well, with the Voting Rights Act, what was happening is the federal government was going in and they were marking out specific states that had a history of keeping African Americans from the polls. So they had gone in and they had done those literacy tests, they had done poll taxes, they had done all those other things that you talk about and study in your history class. And as a result, you saw a lot of voter suppression when it came to minority votes. If you made that list, the bad list, then the federal government said, before you make any change to your election law, you've got to come get approval for it first through us. Now, why did they do that? Think back to the chapter that we just covered when we were talking about Chapter 1. Remember that in Chapter 1, you have the state of Texas that goes in and they passed that bill that restricted women's rights to access. That was 2013. Now, think about what I said with regards to when finally it made it up to the United States Supreme Court, 2016. So even if something is unconstitutional, it can take a really long time to make its way through the court system, especially to get to the highest court. And what happened with this idea of preclearance is that we didn't want people to be deprived of the right to vote for 3 years until this law was overturned and then a new one was put in place. We thought that was too important of a thing that was being violated. And so what we basically said was, if you have this long history of racial discrimination within your state, then your state needs to get pre-approval. And so that made sure that African Americans and Latino voters were able to basically go out and cast their vote without any sort of restrictions that would be racially restricted. Now, obviously, though, from the state perspective, they see this as an encroachment on their reserved powers. So these are some of the things that start to lead people to feel like this is no longer cooperative federalism, maybe this is coercive federalism. And coercive federalism is just this policy that the national government directs states on policies that they have to take. And it's met with a lot of resistance, particularly in southern states, and Texas is no exception to that. Some areas that you see that are going to be with the Affordable Care Act. That was the act that mandated that everyone have health insurance. It was the one with the individual mandate. We're going to talk about that later on. Environmental policy regulations. So there's a state agency that oversees environmental regulations called the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. But then on a federal level, we also have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And so a lot of times you see Texas butting heads with the federal government and saying, hey, federal government, like, why is the EPA stepping in on this? We have our own state institutions that should be in charge of this. And then finally, VRA enforcement, the Voting Rights Act enforcement. We're going to talk about the VRA more. The really important section with preclearance was basically done away with in a not too long ago court decision. So that's become both less and more of an issue that we're going to cover in one of our later chapters. Okay. Let's talk about those grants that we were talking about. So remember, we had categorical grants originally, and then over time we had that process of devolution where we moved more towards block grants. Well, the federal government continues to give quite a bit of aid to Texas in the form of federal grant money. So federal grants are the second largest source of revenue for Texas. And our grant revenue is growing. Texas has an expanding population, we have a large low-income population, and we have a rise in the number of seniors. So anytime we're talking about vulnerable populations, we know that they're going to need more social support services, which means that we're going to be more reliant on the federal government in the form of governmental aid, which on the one hand is really good, right? Like, let's take a look at this picture on the next slide here. Over time, you can see that we've gotten more and more aid from the federal government. That's great. We get to do more things with it, right? The flip side to that, though, is that usually the federal government doesn't just hand you money and say, here you go, have fun. We're just handing this to you because we think it'd be great for you. Sometimes they do, but very rarely. Most of the time what they're doing is they're saying, you can have this money if you do this thing we want you to do. Remember, the way that the Constitution is framed is that we've constrained the federal government in terms of what it's able to do. So the federal government, remember, always has to look first, do I see this power listed? Do I have some kind of basis to be able to do this? If not, then they have to go to the states and try to convince the states to do this thing that they want to do. So a good example of this is drinking age. Think back on that chart. Alcoholic beverages, those are up to the states, not up to the federal government. So it's up to the states to set what the drinking age is going to be. But if you think about it, all of the states now have the age of 21. That's because the federal government offered the states money, but they said that in exchange for that money, they all had to go in and raise the drinking age. So the good part about getting all this grant money is then we have additional money to do all of these things that we want to do. The bad part about getting this grant money is that we oftentimes are giving up a lot of our state power that's provided in the Constitution and saying, sure, federal government will enact pieces of legislation that look the way that you want them to look. So there's two sides of that. Okay, other indirect ways that we benefit and are also reliant on the federal government are going to be through our military bases. A while back, we actually had some base closures that largely did not affect Texas, which was good for us. But there was a move to close a lot of bases through something called BRCA. And so it has been an area of concern because in Texas, we have the third largest active duty military in the nation. And these military bases provide jobs and spending, not just for the military personnel, but for the little towns that crop up around these military bases. So we used to have a map. I don't know what I do with the map. It used to be this little picture of the different bases throughout Texas. And you can see that most of them are located in areas that are relatively rural. And so what you see is anytime there's a base, you see a little town that pops up around it. Well, when the base closes, all of the people who were buying groceries or going to the diner or doing any of those other things, that all basically stopped. And so we're indirectly benefiting, but also indirectly reliant on the number of military installations that we have here in the state. Okay, unfunded mandates. Unfunded mandates are obligations imposed on states by federal government with little or no funding. So this is basically where the federal government can come in and tell the states, you have to do this thing, but we're not going to give you funding for it, or we're not going to give you enough funding for it. Good example of this is going to be the No Child Left Behind Act. In the No Child Left Behind Act, we saw the federal government come in and say, states, you have to enact all of these things to make sure that all of these students are college ready, able to read, do all of these other things that we think that they should be able to do on the federal level. Well, the federal government provided some money to the states, but it didn't provide nearly enough money to accomplish all of those things. So it was up to the states to figure out where they were going to get the rest of that funding from. So another example, the mandates imposed by state of Texas on lower levels of government. You can see this with the Hazelwood Legacy Act. So this was the 2009 Act. The Hazelwood Act originally allowed for veterans to basically use a certain number of free educational credit hours. The 2009 Hazelwood Legacy Act was an expansion of that. It allowed veterans to transfer their credit hours to their dependent children under the age of 26, which substantially increased the number of students benefiting from this measure. In 2009, prior to the expansion, the cost to schools as a result of the Hazelwood Act was $24.6 million, a cost that increased to as much as $379 million by last year. So this was an example of Texas basically coming in and telling lower levels of government what they were going to do without enough funding. Okay, let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. So there were two main parts of the Affordable Care Act. This is the act that people colloquially knew as Obamacare, and you're also going to hear it referred to as the ACA. The two main things that it did was it required Medicaid expansion, number one, and number two, it provided an individual mandate. So let's switch over to our whiteboard really quick for those of you who are a little bit more visual, and let's take a look at that. Okay, so we've got, do this. We've got number one, Medicaid expansion. Okay, so Medicaid expansion is just health insurance provided by the government for low-income individuals. Okay, so we've got health insurance provided for low-income individuals. Now we have Medicaid in all states, but Medicaid expansion was basically going to make it easier for individuals to qualify for Medicaid. So if previously the qualifications for a family of one were that you had to make $12,000 or less per year, now we are going to move them up by mandate. So if they were $12,000, now they're going to be $15,000. So, and it would be changed basically on an annual basis based on the poverty line. Well, the problem with this was that the federal government was going to pick up all of the costs initially, but then was going to transition to picking up 90% of the cost, and the state was going to be on the hook for the other 10%. States were not very happy about this. So that's where the issue came in, because even though at first the federal government was going to pay all of the money for these low-income individuals or for these additional low-income individuals to have Medicaid, over time, some of that burden was then going to go over to the state. So that's the first part. Now let's talk about the second part. The second part was the individual mandate. The individual mandate said that everyone had to have health insurance. And if you didn't have health insurance, that you were going to be charged a penalty. So the state of Texas is one of those states that's really unhappy about this. And they feel like the federal government is coming in and overreaching. They don't think that constitutionally they get to do that. So remember, we're always going to start first by looking at Article 1, Section 8. Does the federal government get to do this? So in June of 2012, the National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius in the United States Supreme Court actually heard this case, and they decided. So when it came to the Medicaid expansion, they struck that part of it down because they said that the states had to have the option to either opt in or opt out. The way it was originally framed was that the states had to comply with this. So it kind of looked like a grant, but it wasn't really, right? Because the states didn't have the option to opt out. So they were getting this benefit from it, but it wasn't really their choice. So the United States Supreme Court said we can leave that Medicaid expansion portion, but you have to give states the opportunity to opt into the program or opt out of the program. The individual mandate portion with the penalty, we're going to look at Article 1, Section 8. And there, we don't see anything about a penalty, but we do see something about a tax. We see that Congress has the ability to tax. And so what the court decides is that it's not really a penalty that's being paid, it's a tax that's being paid. And because Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress gets the tax, well, then the individual mandate portion is okay and is deemed constitutional. So that was the Supreme Court's holding as it related to the Affordable Care Act. Now let's talk about this first portion, the Medicaid expansion, the opting in or the opting out. Go back to our PowerPoint real quick. Okay. So remember we said Texas was not very fond of this. They were one of the ones who were really, really upset that the federal government had done this. And so Texas decided that they were going to opt out of Medicaid expansion. What resulted was a coverage gap. That means we had a lot of individuals who otherwise would have qualified for health insurance if we'd followed along with that plan, but no longer got it. So as a consequence, more than 600,000 Texans today find themselves known as being people in the coverage gap. They're too wealthy to qualify for Medicaid and too poor to qualify for federal health insurance subsidies that you can get through that health insurance marketplace. So basically, they're not poor enough to get free governmental health care, but they also don't make enough to really purchase their own health insurance. So Texas accounts for more than 25% of unfunded potential Medicaid beneficiaries. That means across the nation of the individuals who could have benefited from this Medicaid expansion, but didn't because their state opted out, we have 1/4 of that population within our state. Now, there's two sides to every story, right? So the good part from the state of Texas perspective is, yes, initially the federal government was going to cover 100% of the cost, but then we were going to have to cover 10%. And that was going to be a huge portion, if you think about that. If we have 1/4 of the potential unfunded Medicaid beneficiaries in the state of Texas, 10% of that number is going to be very, very large for Texas to come up with. So it would have to be an increase in taxes, or we'd have to borrow more money, or we'd have to take money away from other sources. So from the state of Texas perspective, they're going to say it's a good thing that we opted out. The flip side to that, though, is this huge coverage gap, where we've got a lot of people who are not insured who otherwise could have been insured, which can be devastating for them financially, but also oftentimes that cost is passed along, right, to the other people who are paying their emergency room bill. So it can also affect individuals who have insurance. Okay, we pretty thoroughly covered, I feel like, the women's whole health decision. We talked about the fact that it placed an undue burden on women and that the court overturned it. Like I said before in our last session, stay tuned, watch the Supreme Court, because they are literally basically deciding the exact same case again, which is very unusual. they're doing it just in Louisiana this time. So that's something to stay tuned to. We did talk about the ramifications, but just to go a little bit more in depth on this slide, as a result of that decision, instead of having only 10 abortion clinics, which would have been located solely in Austin, DFW, Houston, and San Antonio, instead we have 17, which are in 4 major metro areas as well as some other areas as well. So the federal government, again, in that case, stepped in the form of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stepped in and said, hey, state of Texas, what you're doing isn't constitutional. You need to change it. Okay. Part of this idea of federalism is that we allow the state and the federal government to basically coexist. And the states get to work as little laboratories. They get to figure out what works for them. Because what might work in Texas maybe doesn't work in Colorado or maybe doesn't work in California, and vice versa. So they're able to go in and decide, what are we going to do with regards to different things like marijuana legalization or casino gambling? Oh, sorry, y'all. I didn't flip the slides. Sorry, learning curve. Okay. So let's go ahead to here. Okay. So federalism and casino gambling. As we know, Texas has maintained a ban on casino gambling. We do have some small gaming facilities, but they're on reservations, which technically, even though those reservations are located within the state of Texas, it's actually sovereign land for that Indian nation. So they get to create their own laws. But when we're talking about the actual laws in the state of Texas, we don't have casino gambling here. But if you're looking at a map, you can actually see that there's going to be casinos that are put all up along the Texas border with other states. So like Shreveport, great example of this. WinStar, great example of this. You've got all of these casinos that pop up right on the Texas border. It's because there's a lot of people from Texas who are gambling. They're just crossing state lines. So this is a good example of the states working as laboratories. So let's look again at our whiteboard just briefly. Okay. Over here, we're going to have Texas, and over here, we're going to have Oklahoma. Okay. And up here, we're going to have casinos. Okay. So Texas, they've decided that they don't want casinos because they've decided that they're going to prioritize other things. So what are some of the things they've decided that they're going to prioritize? Well, in casinos, the casinos tend to ply people with alcohol because you're more likely to make a bad decision and spend a lot of money if you have been consuming alcohol. So Texas might be concerned about an increase in drunk driving. They might be concerned about an increase in bankruptcy filing. They might be concerned about gambling addiction. Oklahoma, though, when they're looking at those casinos and whether or not they should allow them, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about tax revenue from hotels, liquor, etc. They're thinking about an increase in tourism to their area. So it's not that either side is right or wrong. It's just they have different priorities. If we look over here at Texas, they've placed their priority as that of safety. If we look over here at Oklahoma, they've placed their priority as money, revenue. So neither side's right or wrong. We get to allow both to enact laws that work for them. That's one of the ideas behind federalism that you're exploring in this chapter. So let's erase that real quick. And now let's talk about marijuana legalization. Okay, let's take Texas. And let's take Colorado. Okay, Texas, we allow it for medicinal purposes in very constrained circumstances. Like if you're dying from cancer. If you just have cancer and you're not dying, apparently you're out of luck. But if you're like dying from cancer or you have intractable epilepsy or anything like that, then we basically say, okay, that's fine. We will allow you to consume marijuana. Colorado, though, allows it for recreational purposes. So Texas, no on recreational purposes. Colorado, yes. So what's Texas concerned about? Well, Texas might be concerned about an increase in crime because there is a statistical link between individuals who are high on a particular substance and their incidence rate of committing crime. What else might they be concerned about? Increased crime. Let's say they might also be concerned about driving under the influence. You might be concerned that once it's legalized, they'll have more people who are doing it and then getting behind the wheel of a car. You might be concerned about it being a gateway drug. Now let's look over at Colorado. Colorado is going to say, okay, we think that's a great source of tax revenue, so we think that it's going to provide employment in our state. So over here, again, you see Texas placing the priority on safety, and you see Colorado placing its priority on money, on the economy. Neither one is necessarily right or wrong. It's just that the states are allowed to basically decide for themselves what works well. Now, here's the other part of them working as a laboratory. Texas has been gradually relaxing its restrictions on marijuana over time. And in part, what they're doing is they get to see how that experiment is working out in other states like Colorado. So they get to look and see, oh, has Colorado seen an increase in crime? Has Colorado seen an increase in tax revenue? Have they seen an increase in employment? They get to sit back and watch what's happening in Colorado and figure out, is that something that looks good for our state, or should we continue to not allow it here? So that's another part of the laboratory scheme. Now, here's where the marijuana thing gets a little bit tricky. Technically, the federal government gets to enact laws as well, right? And one of them has to do with safety as it relates to drugs. And so on the federal scale, marijuana is still classified as a Schedule I drug. Now, what happens technically when there is a conflict between state and federal law? So when Colorado said it's A-okay, but the federal government said, nope, it's not, who wins? The federal government, right? Because of the supremacy clause. So in that example, if the federal government really wanted to push the issue, they could go in and they could shut down all of those dispensaries if they wanted to. They don't want to push the issue. So right now it's just kind of a don't hassle us sort of situation, and we're not going to hassle you about it. But technically there's a conflict there. And technically if push came to shove, the federal government would win because of the supremacy clause. Okay, let's see, do we have any other slides left? I think that is it for Chapter 2. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will be working on the Chapter 3 PowerPoint.